Welcome back. Trade got a lot more complicated in 2018.
None more so than in the trading relations between the two largest economies, China and the United States. Trade war was one of the buzz terms of 2018. At every turn, it seemed as if the United States was looking to pick fights with its major trading partners. China was one of the main targets. Starting in January, the U.S. imposed a tariff on solar panel imports, most of which were manufactured in China. Then in July, the U.S. specifically targeted China by imposing 25% tariffs on $34 billion of imported Chinese goods. China responded with similar tariffs on American products. U.S. agricultural goods were a target designed to hurt Trump, who was supported by farmers in the 2016 election. A tariff on an additional $16 billion of Chinese goods was added mid-August, with China responding in kind. Another round of tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods took effect on September 24th. China responded with $60 billion on American imports. Washington accused Beijing of unfair trade practices and denying American firms unrestricted access to China's market. Then there were complaints that Chinese firms stole intellectual property to the detriment of their American competitors. One of the early victims of the trade spat was Chinese technology firm ZTE, China's second largest maker of telecoms equipment. In the summer, it faced possible bankruptcy when Washington imposed a 7-year ban on sales of U.S. technology to ZTE over its exports to Iran and North Korea. American authorities lifted the ban in July. This after ZTE paid a $1 billion fine and agreed to replace its executive team. Trade tensions between the two came to a boil in December when Trump and President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The two leaders agreed on a trade truce in which the U.S. agreed not to raise tariffs again on Chinese goods for a 90-day period. China, in return, agreed to buy more American goods. But the details of the truce remain sketchy at best, with many doubting it will last. Indeed, in December, Canadian authorities arrested the CFO of Chinese tech giant Huawei for extradition to the U.S. over the company's alleged violations of Iran sanctions. Two Canadians, one who was a former diplomat, were detained in China in a move that many saw as retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. It was yet another move that convinced many the truce was only a brief pause in the ongoing trade war. But it wasn't just China. America's allies also felt the heat. Washington imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on the European Union. It followed that up with a warning that EU auto exports to America would be the next to fall victim to higher duties. In the end, EU and U.S. officials stopped an all-out trade war in July. Europe agreed to buy more natural gas and soy from the United States while Washington dropped its threat to impose tariffs. Turkey was another country to feel the U.S. trade wrath. Long considered an important NATO ally, the U.S. steadily imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Turkey in 2018. Ankara retaliated with heavy tariffs on U.S. cars, alcohol, and tobacco in the summer, but the trade crisis started to affect Turkey's economy. Turkey's currency, the lira, plunged to a record low against the U.S. dollar. U.S.-Turkey tensions were also high due to a disagreement over the fate of American pastor Andrew Brunson. He was imprisoned in Turkey back in 2016 over charges he was linked to a failed coup against Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The Trump administration pressured Ankara to release Brunson by sanctioning Turkish officials. Brunson was released in October. America's NAFTA partners, Mexico and Canada, also came under threat of Washington's trade sanctions. The U.S. wanted a revised version of the NAFTA agreement, which underpins all trade between the three countries. Trump said the existing pact encouraged U.S. companies to move jobs to low-wage Mexico. In October, a breakthrough, as negotiators announced the USMCA will replace NAFTA and take effect in the second half of 2019. Tensions over trade boiled over when Trump attended the G7 summit of industrialized nations hosted by Canada in June. Trump refused to sign a joint statement, something which is standard protocol for these summits. At first, differences over America's tariffs on steel and aluminum seemed to have been papered over in a joint statement that endorsed a rules-based trading system. But Canada's Prime Minister also said his country would not be pushed around on trade, infuriating Trump. Trump responded by instructing his officials as he flew to Singapore to meet Kim Jong-un that the U.S. should not endorse the final statement. The discord at the G7 stood in stark contrast to the unified image presented by the rival Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Host China, along with Russia, India, and nations from Central Asia, appeared united on issues to do with security and trade. Roughly a month later, more discord at the NATO summit. Trump accused Germany of failing to pay enough on defense and becoming a captive of Russia by relying on Moscow for natural gas.
It's getting so much of its energy from Russia. So we're supposed to protect Germany, but they're getting their energy from Russia. Explain that. And it can't be explained, you know that.
Trump dropped another bombshell when he suggested the U.S. could go it alone if other NATO members didn't contribute their fair share of defense spending. Then, in November, during ceremonies marking the end of World War I, Trump picked a fight with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron. Macron suggested Europe needed its own army to protect itself from the hostile intentions of Russia, China, and even the United States. Trump was not amused and lashed out at Macron on Twitter. He reminded the French president that his country might be speaking German today had it not been for U.S. support in World War I and World War II. Other things that rattled America's allies this year included the official move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. It triggered massive protests, resulting in hundreds of Palestinian casualties on the Gaza border. Then, near Christmas, Trump announced he was pulling U.S. troops out of Syria and reducing America's military presence in Afghanistan. But perhaps the most serious crisis came from the decision this year to reinstate U.S. sanctions against Iran. It was strongly criticized by allies as well as foes like China and Russia. In May, the Trump administration decided to withdraw the United States from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran and reimpose sanctions on Tehran.
In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States.
The restoration of U.S. sanctions in November targeting Iran's oil and banking sectors was part of a wider effort by Trump to force Tehran to halt its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. More tensions with Russia emerged in the autumn when the U.S. threatened to withdraw from a landmark treaty signed in 1987, curbing the tests of certain nuclear missile technology. Washington accused Moscow of repeatedly violating the treaty while complaining it didn't curb the ambitions of powers like China and Iran. Still, Trump was prepared to sit down for face-to-face talks with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. That didn't sit easily with America's European allies. In July, Trump and Putin met in Helsinki in an exchange that was heavily criticized by the Western press. Trump was seen as being soft on Putin on a range of issues. This included Russia's proxy war with Ukraine, allegations it interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and accusations Moscow waged cyber warfare on its enemies. One of the biggest disappointments was the impression that Trump did not press Putin on the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the English town of Salisbury in March. It quickly became apparent that the Soviet-era nerve agent had been used on the pair. A British police officer helping to investigate the case also fell ill. All three eventually recovered after intensive care. Weeks later, 2 more people became sick after touching an object that was laced with the poison. One of them died. The case shocked Britain and the wider world. Investigations pointed to the Russian state, with Britain convinced it was authorized at the highest level. Moscow denied all responsibility and waged a campaign of deflection, confusion, and misinformation designed to cast doubt on Russia's culpability. UK authorities later released CCTV footage of 2 men who were identified as agents of the Russian state working under special aliases. The case brought relations between Russia and Britain to a new low. But Putin endured, with the Russian president winning another term in office. Then, in October, attention turned to Saudi Arabia. At the beginning of the month, reports surfaced that the prominent Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was living in exile in America, had disappeared while visiting the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. It soon became apparent the mild critic of the Saudi kingdom had not disappeared mysteriously. He was brutally murdered. Turkish intelligence claimed they had tapes which suggested that Khashoggi was ambushed by Saudi agents, tortured, and then dismembered while still alive. Riyadh initially denied any role in his disappearance, but under pressure from Turkish authorities, it identified 18 suspects in the case. Saudi Arabia said they will face justice in the kingdom. Ankara has repeatedly called for them to be extradited to Turkey for trial. The case tested Saudi Arabia's relations with the wider world, including with important allies like Britain and the United States. Both the U.S. and Europe expressed their outrage. But all stopped short at blaming the kingdom's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Many suspected the Crown Prince ordered Khashoggi's murder. And still to come tonight, the gloves come off as Republicans and Democrats slug it out for control of Congress.